Hello and welcome to Thinkpod, powered by the FII Institute. I'm your host, Mark Barton, and for over 2 decades, I've been at the forefront of global conversations on the issues that matter the most. In this series, I'll be meeting the leaders who are rising to tackle the grand challenges that face humanity right now. Together, we'll be discussing the radical ideas and the transformative solutions that'll benefit both people and planet. This episode, I'm joined by Anna Moore, partner at McKinsey & Company. Anna is a sustainability specialist with a passion for basic materials and the built environment. We discuss creating value in the net zero transition and the disruptive power of activist investors. Anna, thank you very much for joining me today.
Mark, thanks for having me, and an enormous thanks to FII. Terrific to be with you.
Thank you. McKinsey, I love to blow everyone away with stats. Let's bombard them with stats, Anna. McKinsey estimates there may be $9 to $12 trillion a year in annual value from new green growth markets in the net zero transition. And what you do is you talk about companies moving from playing defense to playing offense with sustainability. What do you mean by that?
And indeed, it's a nice McKinsey range in there, so I'll take you through a little bit how we get there. So what we mean by playing offense is you've had a lot of corporates who've thought about sustainability as a risk mitigation matter, right? And that's fine, and they've explained to the capital markets why they're going to survive the transition. What they haven't done is explain how it's going to actually be a tailwind for them. And so then they're valued less than they were before. And so what we're starting to see some leaders doing is really explaining how they will capture and create green growth and why their terminal value should be higher, why they're a more investable business than they were before. So that's what we mean by playing offense. It's not just talking about risk mitigation and compliance, but really talking about how this is a growth lever for them. And the $9 to $12 trillion a year is for us a combination of energy transition technologies, circular materials, new material science, building transition, a whole host of direct decarbonization businesses, as well as the services that will need to support those. You know, it'll be the largest driver of economic growth in our lifetimes.
Yeah, what's the green premium then?
Fabulous question. The green premium is something I'm really excited about because I think it aligns, if you like, value and values in a way that makes us optimistic about the transition. The green premium refers to, in many industries, an emerging gap between supply and demand. So take steel, for instance, where you have about a 60% shortage of green steel supply versus demand. That creates an enormous premium for green steel product. We estimate $300 to $400 a ton. That will stimulate investment by steel makers and the iron ore producers who support them in more green technology. And so this for us is a driver of economic growth as well as a contributor to the transition.
Let's talk about some of the industries that you focus on and get ready to be bombarded with more amazing McKinsey stats. 27% of carbon emissions come from our existing buildings.
Yep.
Another 20% from construction and materials like steel, which you mentioned, concrete and aluminium. So we have to tackle those things. We have to have greener buildings, greener construction, greener materials. I mean, that essentially is your day job, isn't it?
Yeah. I spend all of my time decarbonizing metals, mining, and the built environment. And when we come to buildings, actually we've decarbonized less quickly in construction and the built environment than we have in energy and in transport.
Why is that?
I think it's because it's quite a challenging system-level problem to decarbonize building operations because you need to deal with tenants in the home. People don't want to retrofit. They don't want to lose space in the building from insulation. And so there's been a real gap in this sector versus, for example, transport or versus energy.
Is there less of a focus on it?
I think there's less of a focus and less of a realization of what some of the value might be.
Yeah.
So to bombard you with more stats,
please do.
We estimate $800 billion to $1.9 trillion in investment that will be required annually in order to decarbonize the built environment. Now, where is that going, right? Part of that is greener materials, about $320 billion in new markets that'll be created from green cement, insulation, all of this. $280 trillion in retrofit. And that's what I was speaking about a moment ago, of really transitioning homes to be more energy efficient. And that will require quite a nuanced public-private sector partnership because we'll need to support the transition of social housing. We'll need to rehouse the 1 billion people who will live in heat-stressed regions globally. And so that will create an enormous need for public sector investment, but also opportunity for engineering and construction firms.
What more can be done to bring forth this public and private investment?
I think it goes to what we were discussing a moment ago around playing offense and really capturing the opportunity. Construction tends to be a slightly staid business and risk-averse for reasons that are completely understandable. But I think it's a time now where we have public sector regulation that facilitates investment, and it's really the moment for private sector leadership in capturing that opportunity.
Are you sensing that leadership?
We're starting to, for sure, right? And you can think there are several market leaders who have announced net zero goals themselves within the sector. That makes us optimistic around how this might transition and where we might go.
Yeah, how does insurance play into this? Because I know there's realized insurance savings. Do we need to do more then to bring the true cost of external damage into the discussion of the costs of building greener?
Yeah, it's a great point. And I think it's not just limited to buildings, but more widely, financial markets haven't actually yet factored in the true cost of the transition. So you can still insure a home in Miami. You can still insure a home in the Florida coast. That's crazy. And so what we need to do is have financial markets appropriately factor in what the cost of climate mitigation is going to be, but also crucially the cost of climate adaptation. And that we don't yet see factored in. We've recently acquired a business, Vivid Economics, who do a lot of thinking around the inevitable cost and the economic price that we are all going to pay. Factoring this into how we price carbon markets is going to be critical.
Yeah, you talk about a first mover problem between policy, funding, projects, which is stymieing the industry. What is that, and how should CEOs respond?
So for us, this is really about, if you like, throttle control. So businesses are worried, okay, if I move first, am I actually going to make the investment that solves the problem for the industry? So I've incurred that cost, but I'm not going to be the only one who reaps the reward. And so people are kind of looking at each other, to see who's going to bear most of this cost. And I think it goes back to a bit of the green premium we were talking about earlier, where actually by the mid-2030s, a lot of these investments will be made. The green premium will no longer exist because supply will have caught up to demand. And companies that aren't starting to make those investments now are going to lose out. And so for us, this is actually more a matter of early investment, and those who do that are going to capture a disproportionate share of reward versus waiting and seeing.
And you're advising companies. Is there a keenness to be that first mover? I mean, how much persuasion is needed by you?
I think corporates are now in a place versus 5 years ago when I was advising companies on this, and you had to kind of convince, look, net zero is real, this is all coming. Now we have nearly 90% of CO2 emissions are covered by net zero pledges. You have 25 to 50% of CPG companies who've committed to fully recycled content in several of their product lines by the 2030s. So I think people have caught up. The question is moving from pledges to real plans.
Yeah, pledges to action.
Mm-hmm, exactly. It's less a matter of convincing people that this matters and more a matter of, truly making the investments, taking action, and making it happen.
Yeah, that's construction, mining.
Sure.
Mining and metals. The viewers and our listeners are being, is there a narrative problem when it comes to mining and green?
For sure there is.
Yes. Justified or not?
I think justified.
Yeah.
In metals in particular, right?
Yeah.
You mentioned steel earlier. That's, 7% of CO2 emissions? Concrete is another 7-8%. I mean, these are heavily carbon-emitting industries. Mining a touch less so, but still it's part of the same value chain.
Yeah.
And so there's an urgent need to decarbonize them.
Yeah.
There's value that can be created through it. I quoted earlier the green steel premium that we expect. But I think the other important role that mining in particular and metals is going to play is in facilitating the energy transition.
Yeah.
So we will need 300 times as much lithium and nickel in order to power EVs as we produce today. That's going to come not just from new extraction, which of course has an environmental toll, but also from greater circularity and recycling of metals. And so this industry is a critical enabler of battery technology and needs to find a more circular, less highly emitting way to produce the fuel cells that we need.
What's your view on a certain EV company being dropped from an ESG index because of issues, whether it's the way employees are treated?
Sure.
Or is that fair when the company's core mission is producing electric cars, which obviously isn't a bad thing?
For me, this comes to a need to focus holistically on E, S, and G.
Yeah.
And we have the most urgent call to action around E, but we can't forget about S and G while we're doing that. In our view, a lot of challenges that we're seeing on the E and the S side come from a failure of governance. How did we get to where we are? A failure of collective action. This is a classic tragedy of the commons. And so we need to see companies acting and behaving in appropriate ways, ensuring responsible supply chains and procurement, while also contributing to net zero goals. We can't forget about corporate governance fundamentals.
Should E, S, and G be weighted equally?
Well, happily, I am not in the business of running an ESG index, but for us, they need to be considered holistically.
Yes.
They should be priced into investment decisions, and they should be part of how investors assess the attractiveness of corporates.
Yeah, come back to mining. How reluctant are investors then to put money into mining, given what we've discussed?
I think it's interesting because you have, on the one hand, enormous pledges towards net zero transition, but you still have huge asset flows into traditional mining as well as oil and gas companies. The market cap of the top 5 increased from last year to this year. We're still seeing considerable investment in, if you like, conventional energy, conventional mining, conventional metals. And so what we need to start to see is an acceleration of asset flows into renewable technologies, into more responsible mining and metals production. We estimate, I'll throw another stat at you, about $9.5 trillion of annual investment that's going to be needed in order to reach a net zero pathway by the 2050s, right? That's 7.5% of global GDP that's going to have to shift away from conventional asset allocation towards sustainable assets.
So what's the role for alternate finance then?
We will need to see private capital going towards this as well, right? And so I think as we've seen over the last 10, 15 years, a shift towards private markets and private equity away from public markets, we will need to see the same focus and pressure around ESG in private capital flows as well.
Yeah, and what does it take then, talking about shifts, to shift mining from carbon reduction to green value creation?
I think it takes a realization that this is the long-term source of value. Goes back to what we were saying earlier around what will markets really look like? Who is actually going to capture $9 to $12 trillion a year in new green growth? It will be those who make investments now. And so I think for miners, this will be both investment in new technologies, so electrifying their fleets, their mining equipment, et cetera. It'll also take better mine planning. So less underground mining. It will take massive investment in exploration in a smarter, less environmentally detrimental way than we've done before. And so that's an enormous engineering problem as well as an investment and capital flow problem.
Let's talk about investor activism, the movement, the activist investor movement. You're a co-leader of McKinsey's work on activist investor response in Europe. What is an activist investor first?
Sure. An activist investor is a fund that takes positions in companies in order to influence particular action. So often they will attempt to get a seat on the board in order to change the value creation strategy. This can be, calling for M&A, trying to block M&A, calling for divestment, et cetera.
How effective are they at initiating change?
Pretty effective.
Yeah.
You have several businesses like Elliott and others who are massive investors. If they take a 5, 7, 10% stake in a business, they can really turn it around. And I think what's interesting in ESG activism is on the one hand, you've had activism pushing for more environmental sustainability. You can think about ExxonMobil, for instance, now having an activist. On the other hand, you've had some activists who've said, look, folks, let's get back to basics and pressure on, for instance, Unilever and Danone to roll back some of their ESG activities. And so, it's not to say exactly. And so this, for me, goes back to companies needing to play offense with sustainability and show not just that they're doing this out of the goodness of their hearts, but that it's also a driver of profit, which in our view, it is. And that's what gives us optimism that you have an alignment between, if you like, value and values.
Companies should not wait to be prompted by activist shareholders. Rather, they should create a more inclusive and professional board by proactively adding to the current composition of the group. So board makeup is so important.
So critical.
Yeah.
Exactly. Having an inclusive, diverse board that's able to bring different perspectives, that's able to really generate insight around ESG and draw on other industries. Goes back to our conversation around the importance of G in facilitating E&S.
Are activist investors a threat to business? Can they be perceived as a threat?
In our view, and based on the research that we've done, the best model is when you can collaborate with the activist.
Yeah.
So when an activist pushes and the company fully rejects, typically you see value destruction, either in the case where the activist wins or where the corporate wins, right? Because typically an activist will have good points, but they won't know your business inside and out. And so this is about actually seeing where the challenges are fair and then explaining where they're not and coming to the table together to create more inclusive, more sustainable value.
And are boards open to it, to those activist investors?
I think they should be. Are
some
they all? Some are, some aren't. And
Yeah.
really it's incumbent on the board to see this as an opportunity. Activists are there because they've looked at your business sometimes for 1 or 2 years, and said, I see areas where you are leaving money on the table, or you're not behaving appropriately, you're not a good steward of resources. Some of those challenges will be fair. The spirit in which it's intended is value creation, and boards can and should accept where there are real challenges and patiently and properly explain where the challenges aren't fair.
Public companies going private, how does that impact the activist investor?
Sometimes activists will push for that.
Yeah.
Really, it's just a matter of if that's part of their value creation thesis for the business.
Yeah, interesting. You've summed up the whole setup so wonderfully, and your background is it's incredible. Sustainable strategy, green investment.
You're just flattering me, Mark.
Green growth strategy, green financing, capital markets positioning. When you step back and look at the progress we're making in all these areas, green investment, green growth, green financing, capital markets, where are we lacking? Where would you like to see more policy, more regulation, more incentives?
Yeah, I think that we've seen significant underinvestment and lack of focus on a just transition and on ESG in emerging markets. And I think when investors look at emerging markets and ESG, they kind of think, oh gosh, this is all a bit too expensive, a bit too complicated. They think about the billion people who are going to live in heat-stressed regions and gosh, how is all of this going to unfold? And for us, what they should be focusing on, same as they do in developed markets, is where they can align value creation with progress on environmental and social goals. And so for us, for example, within plastics, we will need to see considerable push towards circularity. You already have about a $2,000 per ton premium for green recycled PET versus virgin product. It comes from the supply-demand gap that we spoke about before. A lot of that feedstock is in emerging markets. And so companies that are investing in, for instance, setting up circular supply chains in India, for just one example, will create economic growth as well as contribute to sustainable job creation in those countries and to our net zero goals. And so for us, investors need to be approaching emerging market green value creation in the same way that they approach this in developed markets.
Are you advising clients on this?
For sure. So we work with clients on how their global sustainable investments should look, where they can create green growth globally. And for us, this is a system-level challenge. It's not just a European question or an American question. It's really a global challenge. And in our view, will be the biggest driver of global economic growth in our lifetimes.
What keeps you awake at night?
On
this subject matter?
What concerns me are areas where we don't yet see consumer or customer uptake or pressure, So I think we're going to sort out green steel. I think we're going to sort out green cement.
Yeah.
I'm worried about what we were talking about earlier around retrofit.
Yeah.
Because I think about myself, I live in a converted warehouse, great, beautiful brick. And you think, gosh, am I going to put 3 inches of insulation in here? And I think where there's a dependency on consumers to change behavior, it's just fragmented, it's hard, you need public sector action as well as attractive, more innovative private sector solutions that somebody's going to pay for and install and see value in. And so I think we're going to solve some of the upstream challenges. I think where there's a downstream dependency, it's going to be quite tough.
Finish on a positive note. What's encouraging? What inspires you? What keeps you going every single day?
For me, the cause of optimism is this economic growth and green growth point.
Yeah.
The $9 to $12 trillion in new green value pools, for us, will be an alignment between profit incentive and doing the right thing for the planet, and that gives me hope.
Yeah, you can make money and do the right thing.
Exactly, and this will be an engine of economic growth and a considerable opportunity and a chance for companies to really play offense while doing the right thing.
Perfect. We ended as we started. Thank you, Anna. Brilliant.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. In these turbulent times, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe to ThinkPod for more insight and analysis.